The compound was alive with music and chatter, the kind of warmth that only a Kenyan family gathering could bring. Nairobi's evening sun cast a soft glow over the courtyard, where strings of bright balloons and ribbons swayed with the breeze. The smell of pillau and roasted meat drifted through the air, mingling with the sweet scent of fresh flowers arranged on every table. Children ran around laughing, dodging between chairs while older relatives settled into conversations over plates of food. At the center of it all was Amara, dressed in a simple but elegant dress, her smile lighting up the space even as her eyes betrayed a quiet nervousness. It was her birthday, a day meant to celebrate her life, yet she could already sense the undercurrent of judgment that always seemed to follow her. Family members hugged her warmly, but behind those smiles, she caught the whispers, the comparisons, the subtle shaking of heads. Seated not too far away was Aunt Wanjiku, her eyes sharp and watchful. She didn't need to say much. Her presence alone carried a weight Amara had felt her whole life. Every raised eyebrow, every little smirk was a reminder that she was waiting for the moment to strike. While the music played and the room buzzed with laughter, Amara felt the tension building like a storm hiding in the clouds. Tonight was supposed to be her night, but in the back of her mind she already knew her aunt wouldn't let it pass without a blow. The music softened as the cake was carried out, a tall chocolate one with candles glowing brightly. Everyone gathered around Amara, clapping and singing the birthday song. She smiled, trying to soak in the love of the moment, but her heart beat fast, half with joy, half with dread. She leaned forward, closed her eyes for a second, made a silent wish, and blew out the candles. Cheers filled the air, children shouted, and cameras clicked. For a brief moment, Amara felt like the center of happiness. Then, as the knife was placed in her hand to cut the first slice, Aunt Wanjika's voice cut sharper than any blade. "What are we even celebrating here?" she asked loudly, her tone dripping with scorn. The laughter died almost instantly. Heads turned, the music faded into background noise, and Amara froze, still holding the knife. "You're old now, Amara," the aunt went on, her words striking like daggers. "No husband, no children, no proper job. Tell me, what use are you to this family? Jobless, lazy, and completely useless." The words hung in the air, heavy and humiliating. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Some gasped, others shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between Amara and her aunt. The children, sensing the tension, fell silent too. It was as if the whole compound stopped breathing for a second. Amara's mother, who had been standing proudly beside her moments earlier, lowered her head in shame. She did not speak. She did not defend. That silence pierced Amara's heart more deeply than the words themselves. Her cousins, who had been cheering a moment ago, now avoided her eyes, some smirking, others whispering behind their hands. Amara stood frozen, her smile gone, her throat tight, her hand trembling on the knife. She wanted to speak, to shout, to defend herself, but no sound came. Her ears rang with the echo of the word useless, over and over again, each repetition sinking deeper. The candles still smoked on the cake, the sweet smell filling the air, yet the moment had turned bitter. She could feel her cheeks burn, as if the whole family's eyes were flames on her skin. Even the music, still faintly playing in the background, felt cruel, like it mocked her pain. Wanjiku leaned back in her chair with a satisfied smirk, as if she had finally won some invisible war. The silence that followed was more painful than the insult itself, a silence that said, maybe the aunt was right. And in that silence, Amara swallowed hard, her chest aching. Her birthday cake sat untouched before her, but the sweetness of the night had already been stolen. It was not just a celebration anymore. It had turned into a stage for her humiliation. And everyone was watching. As Amara stood there, holding back tears, her mind drifted away from the party and into the past. It was not the first time she had heard those words from her aunt. They had followed her for years, like shadows she could never escape. She remembered the first time she got her dream job, fresh out of university. She had walked home that day with her heart full, ready to tell her family that finally, life was turning in her favor. But the job lasted only a few months before the company downsized, and she was among those sent home. "Maybe it's not meant for you," Aunt Wanjiku had sneered at the dinner table. "Some people are born to succeed. Others, well, they try." The laughter that followed from cousins still echoed in Amara's ears. Still, she kept trying. She worked in small offices, short contracts here and there, and every time she thought she was about to build something steady, life snatched it away. Bills piled up, and when her younger siblings needed school fees, Amara was the one who stepped in. She sacrificed clothes, outings, even her own dreams of saving for a business, just so her brother could graduate, just so her sister could stay in school. Nobody noticed her sacrifices. Nobody said thank you. Instead, they looked at her as if she had wasted her life. Aunt Wanjiku was the loudest voice in that choir of judgment. Every Christmas, every family gathering, she made sure to remind everyone. "What do you even do these days, Amara? Sit at home and eat. You're the oldest, yet the most disappointing. She said it with a chuckle, but it cut deep. Sometimes others joined in with sly remarks, calling her the family's big girl with small dreams. Even her younger cousins, who she had helped raise, felt bold enough to joke about her failures. At night, Amara would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe she was useless. Maybe her life had no meaning. She prayed, cried quietly into her pillow, and told herself tomorrow would be different. Yet tomorrow always seemed to bring another closed door. What nobody knew was how many times she had tried, how many interviews she had attended with her heart pounding, only to receive rejection email. How many times she had started small businesses, only for them to crumble because of lack of capital. They only saw the failure, never the effort. Through it all, Amara learned to hide her pain behind a smile. She became good at laughing with the family while her chest burned inside. But deep within, she carried a tiny spark, one they had no idea about. A spark that refused to die no matter how much they mocked her. Even when Aunt Wanjika's voice was the loudest, calling her the shame of the family, Amara whispered to herself in the quiet of her room, "One day they'll see." What the family never knew was that while they mocked her, Amara was quietly building something in the shadows. By day, they saw her at home, helping her mother with chores or running small errands, and they assumed she had nothing going on. But when the house went silent at night and everyone was asleep, Amara's real work began. She would sit at her small desk, her old laptop humming, the glow of the screen lighting up her tired face. Coffee cups piled beside her, notebooks filled with scribbles and sketches of ideas. She was not wasting her life. She was writing code, researching, and planning with a small team of young innovators she had met online. They were all dreamers like her, hungry and determined, trying to build a tech startup that could solve real problems in Kenya. Some nights they worked till dawn, connecting on video calls, troubleshooting bugs, or brainstorming new features. The internet would cut out sometimes, forcing her to restart her work again and again. Power outages became normal, but she learned to keep her laptop charged, ready to squeeze every ounce of life from the battery. Her eyes burned from staring at the screen, her fingers cramped from typing, but she pushed through. She sacrificed sleep, social outings, even simple rest. While her cousins went out for parties and posted their fun on social media, Amara stayed in, coding line after line, fixing errors that made her want to pull her hair out. There were moments of doubt, moments when she almost closed the laptop for good. But something deep inside told her to keep going. That little spark, the one she carried through all her struggles, kept her alive. The team she worked with was small but brilliant. One was a gifted programmer from Mombasa, another a designer from Kisumu, and a third a sharp business mind from Nakuru. They had never met in person, yet their bond grew stronger with each late-night call. They believed in their idea, a platform that could connect small local businesses to bigger markets through technology. It was bold, risky, and new, but it was theirs. The sweetest part was that nobody in her family had the slightest clue. To them, she was still the jobless one, the one with wasted potential. They had no idea that contracts were being drafted, that investors were beginning to show interest, that long hours of unseen sweat were finally shaping into something solid. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, when her code finally worked or when her team cracked a problem, Amara would smile to herself in the quiet room. She imagined the day she could finally stand tall, no longer hiding, no longer shrinking under Aunt Wanjika's sharp tongue. For now, it was her secret, her silent fight. They thought she was useless, but only she knew that in the silence of those sleepless nights, she was building the very future that would silence them all. The silence after Aunt Wanjika's words was heavy, almost unbearable. Amara could feel everyone's eyes fixed on her, waiting to see if she would break down or walk away. The cake sat untouched in front of her, the knife still trembling in her hand. Her chest ached, but then, something shifted inside her. Instead of tears, a small smile spread across her face, calm and steady. She placed the knife down gently and cleared her throat. "Actually," she said softly, her voice cutting through the silence, "I brought a gift for myself tonight. Maybe it will explain my so-called uselessness." The room stirred with whispers. A few people exchanged confused glances, unsure what she meant. Even the children looked up with wide eyes, curious. Aunt Wanjika leaned forward, squinting, as if preparing for another chance to mock her. Amara reached under the table and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped box. It wasn't flashy, just a plain brown box with a simple red ribbon tied around it, but she held it with a kind of reverence, as though it carried the weight of her entire life. Slowly, she placed it on the table next to the cake. The family leaned closer, some rising slightly from their seats to get a better view. No one spoke, but the air was thick with curiosity. The aunt's smirk grew. "What is this now, another excuse?" she muttered, but her voice shook just enough to betray her unease. Amara ignored her and carefully pulled at the ribbon. The bow loosened, and she lifted the lid with a deliberate calmness that only deepened the suspense. The rustle of the wrapping seemed louder than the music still faintly playing in the background. It was as if the entire compound was holding its breath. Her mother's eyes followed every movement, a mixture of confusion and quiet hope flickering across her face. The cousins who had been whispering now leaned forward eagerly, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Even the neighbors who had come for the celebration stopped chewing their food, their attention fixed on Amara and the mysterious box. For a moment, Amara paused with the lid halfway open, her hands steady. She looked up and let her gaze sweep across the room. "All my life," she said softly, "I have been called useless. Tonight, I thought it was time to answer that word, but in my own way." The suspense was unbearable now. The aunt shifted uncomfortably in her chair, trying to keep her face stern, though her eyes betrayed curiosity. The children whispered, "What's in the box? What's in the box?" Finally, Amara lifted the lid completely. The box sat open before her, the secret ready to be revealed. The room leaned in as one, hearts racing, waiting to see what truth Amara had been hiding all this time. Inside the box lay 3 simple things, but together they carried the weight of years of struggle. On top were crisp white papers, neatly clipped together. Beneath them was a printed contract with the logo of a well-known multinational company shining boldly at the corner. And resting on top of it all was a sleek gold pen, polished and gleaming under the light. It was not just a pen, it was a symbol of a new beginning. Amara took a deep breath and lifted the papers for everyone to see. "These," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "are the registration documents of my company. And this," she continued, holding up the contract, "is the first deal we signed today. A deal worth millions." Gasps filled the room. Chairs creaked as relatives leaned forward in disbelief. Some covered their mouths, others widened their eyes, and whispers raced across the compound. It was as though time itself had frozen for a "I own a company now," Amara said firmly, her eyes locking on Aunt Wanjiku. "And today we closed our first deal." The words struck like lightning. The same people who had once dismissed her, mocked her, and laughed behind her back were now speechless. Her cousins, who had always found joy in her struggles, stared at the papers with their mouths slightly open, unable to find words. Her mother blinked rapidly, tears welling in her eyes as she tried to process what her daughter had just revealed. But the most striking reaction came from Aunt Wanjiku. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted from the contract to Amara's face and back again. The confidence she had carried only moments ago seemed to melt away. The sharpness in her gaze dulled into shock. For the first time in Amara's life, her aunt was silent. The neighbors whispered, "Did she just say millions?" Someone else muttered, "So all this time." The murmurs spread like wildfire, and with each whisper, Amara's chest grew lighter. She placed the papers back in the box gently, then picked up the gold pen, holding it between her fingers. "This pen signed the contract today," she said softly, her voice almost breaking with pride. "This pen is proof that every late night, every sacrifice, every insult, every time I was called useless, it was never in vain." Her mother finally stepped forward, her hand trembling as she touched the box, as if making sure it was real. Tears slid down her cheeks. "My daughter," she whispered, her voice cracking. Amara smiled at her, then looked back at the crowd. The room was silent, but it wasn't the silence of judgment anymore. It was the silence of awe. The silence that comes when the truth is too powerful to deny. For the first time, Amara stood taller than her pain. She wasn't the useless one anymore. She was the one who had proved them all wrong. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the faint crackle of the candles still burning low on the cake. Then, slowly, the room seemed to come alive again, but in a completely different way. Amara's mother was the first to react. She pressed her hands over her mouth, her shoulders shaking as tears streamed freely down her face. She stepped forward, wrapped her arms around Amara, and held her tight. It was not just a hug, it was years of worry, shame, and silent prayers melting into pride. "My daughter," she whispered again and again, her voice trembling. "My daughter, I knew you were destined for something greater." The cousins who had once whispered behind Amara's back were now clapping, some even cheering loudly to cover their embarrassment. A few shouted her name, almost as if they wanted to rewrite history, to pretend they had always believed in her. One of them pulled out his phone and started recording, eager to capture the moment, maybe even claim they had been part of her journey. The hypocrisy stung a little, but Amara only smiled faintly. Tonight wasn't about them. It was about her finally standing in her truth. The neighbors and guests erupted in murmurs, their voices overlapping with awe. "She owns a company? Millions, did she say? Imagine, all this time we thought." The whispers carried admiration now, not pity. People who had once pitted her mother for having a failure of a daughter were now looking at them with new eyes, eyes full of respect. But Aunt Wanjiku could not hide her shame. She sat stiffly in her chair, her face pale, her lips pressed tightly together. She looked around, realizing every pair of eyes was now on her. The same people who had once nodded along to her cruel words were now whispering about her instead. Her smirk was gone. She fiddled with the edge of her shawl, shifting in her seat as if she wished the ground would open and swallow her whole. Every so often, someone would glance at her, then at Amara, and shake their head. The same whispers she had once spread about her niece had turned against her. "So who's useless now?" one of the uncles muttered under his breath, not caring if she heard. The air in the compound had completely shifted. Where there had been heaviness and tension, there was now joy. The music seemed to grow louder again, laughter returned, and people began clapping and chanting Amara's name. The birthday had transformed into a celebration of her triumph, her resilience, her long-awaited victory. Amara stood tall in the center, her mother's arm wrapped around her, the box of proof beside her, and the whole family finally seeing her for who she truly was. The pain of years of humiliation hadn't disappeared, but at that moment, it no longer defined her. For the first time, the spotlight wasn't on her failures. It was on her strength. And the whole family, whether out of pride, guilt, or sheer amazement, was forced to acknowledge it. Aunt Wanjiku sat frozen, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as if holding on to her pride. For years, she had built her confidence on mocking Amara, on reminding everyone that her niece was the failure. Now the ground beneath her had shifted, and she didn't know how to stand on it. She tried to force a laugh, though it came out shaky and unconvincing. "Papers? Anyone can print papers," she said, waving her hand dismissively. But her voice lacked the usual sharpness. She didn't dare look at the contract too closely, because the company's logo was clear, official, and undeniable. The guests leaned forward to inspect it, some even nodding knowingly. Amara said nothing, only held her gaze with a calm smile that made the aunt even more uncomfortable. For the first time, Wanjiku realized she had no weapon left. Every cruel word she had spoken had just been shattered by solid proof sitting inside that little box. The whispers started softly but grew louder. "So who's useless now?" one of the uncles murmured. A cousin repeated it under his breath, and soon it spread like a ripple across the crowd. People chuckled, some openly shaking their heads at the aunt. Her face flushed deep red, and she snapped, "All of you are so quick to believe. Let's see how long this so-called company lasts." But her words sounded weak, desperate, as though she herself didn't believe them. Amara's mother finally spoke, her voice clear and steady. "Wanjiku, you have humiliated my daughter for years. Tonight, God has silenced you." The guests murmured in agreement, their eyes darting back to the aunt with disapproval. The more she tried to talk, the more people ignored her. They weren't laughing with her anymore, they were laughing at her. Her power was gone. The sharp tongue that once commanded the room now made her look bitter and small. Wanjiku stood abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She grabbed her handbag with trembling hands, muttering angrily as she avoided everyone's eyes. The whispers grew louder as she pushed her way out. Imagine, after all her insults. She must be burning inside. Now she knows how it feels. Some guests smirked as they watched her storm off, her shawl trailing behind her like a defeated flag. Even the children whispered to one another, "She lost." For Amara, watching her aunt leave wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about winning some competition. It was about finally seeing the truth come out, about finally standing in her own light without being overshadowed by someone else's cruelty. The compound seemed lighter the moment Wanjiku disappeared through the gate. The music swelled again, laughter returned, and the celebration resumed with even more energy. The difference was clear. The power of shame had shifted. It no longer sat on Amara's shoulders. It now weighed heavy on the aunt who had carried cruelty as her crown. And that crown had fallen. The compound was still buzzing from Aunt Wanjiku's dramatic exit when Amara slowly stepped forward. She placed the box of documents carefully back on the table and turned to face everyone. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel small in front of them. She didn't feel like the girl who had to explain herself or shrink under their stares. Tonight, she felt taller than she ever had. Her voice was calm, but it carried across the courtyard with surprising strength. "All my life, I've been called useless," she began. The crowd grew quiet instantly, their eyes fixed on her. "I've been mocked, laughed at, even pitted. But tonight, I want to say something to all of you." She paused, her chest rising as she took a deep breath. Never call someone useless just because their success doesn't fit your timeline. Seeds grow differently. Some sprout fast, others take longer, but that doesn't mean they won't bloom. It only means their time hasn't come yet. A ripple went through the crowd. Some nodded. Others lowered their heads in shame as if her words were directed straight at them. Her mother was already wiping tears from her cheeks, clutching her shawl as though holding on to every word. Amara's voice grew stronger. "I was not wasting my life. I was building quietly, failing quietly, and rising quietly. And if I had given up when the insults became too heavy, none of this would have been possible. So let me tell you, Failure is not uselessness. Struggle is not shame. Sometimes, it's just the soil protecting the seed until it's ready to break through. By now, some of the guests were clapping softly, encouraging her to continue. Her cousins, who once mocked her the loudest, looked away, their faces burning with regret. The neighbors leaned forward, hanging on to her words. Even the children seemed unusually still, their eyes wide as though they were watching history unfold. Amara raised the gold pen in her hand and smiled faintly. This pen is more than a tool. It represents patience, hard work, and resilience. I signed my first deal with it today. But what I want you to remember is this. No insult, no gossip, no laughter behind my back could stop me. I chose to keep going, and that's why I stand here now. The clapping grew louder, some guests even rising to their feet. A few had tears streaming down their faces. The energy in the compound was no longer one of pity or doubt, but of admiration and pride. Amara looked around at the faces that once made her feel small and ended with a final truth. The next time you are tempted to call someone useless, remember tonight. Remember that seeds grow differently. And remember that sometimes the person you think is the weakest is just the one preparing for the strongest bloom. The courtyard erupted in applause, louder than any birthday song could have been. For the first time, the sound was for her, and not in mockery, but in honor. The night that had begun with whispers and humiliation ended in a way no one could have imagined. The courtyard was alive again, but this time with joy that came from deep respect. Music played louder, children laughed freely, and the guests kept congratulating Amara, some shaking her hand, others hugging her as if to make up for the years they had doubted her. Her mother stood proudly by her side, no longer with her head bowed, but with her chin lifted high, her eyes shining with pride. For the first time in a long time, Amara felt celebrated, not for what the family expected of her, but for who she truly was. When she picked up the knife again to cut the cake, her hands no longer trembled. She sliced through it with confidence, her smile wide and genuine. The crowd cheered, clapping and singing, but this time the sound was different. It was not just about a birthday. It was about victory, about resilience, about a woman who refused to be crushed by shame. And yet, not everyone shared in the joy. In a quiet corner of the compound sat Aunt Wanjiku, her face stiff, her eyes lowered, her usual sharp tongue silenced. For once, she had no comment, no insult, no laughter to add. She was just quiet. Her silence was louder than any words she could have spoken. As the celebration carried on, the narrator's voice seemed to rise gently above the noise. Sometimes the best gift you can bring to a party is the truth they never expected. And with that, Amara's birthday became a memory no one in that compound would ever forget.